All right, guys, we are back, and wow, I just realized that my eyes get really big when I start off a segment. But we are back with another episode of Bench Stash. This will not be a mock draft episode. We're just going to spit out some fiery takes on our draft perspective.
Yep.
My name is Derek.
My name is Leo, the favorite of the co-hosts. I feel like I say that now every time, but the more I say it, the more people will believe it. Like, it'll be like, what's the word? You know.
The more you say it, the more you'll believe it.
And that's really important. All that matters is that I believe it.
But you're the Peter Dinklage of the team, apparently.
That guy just blew me up, and he was like totally right. And he's not the first person to say that. I've had like people in my close personal life tell me that, but they just have this rando on YouTube to be like, "Oh, Peter Dinklage plays fantasy football." It's like, thanks, guy. Yeah. But also, he's won Emmys, so yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I was gonna say, how does it make you feel?
Feels really good. Feels really good because he's probably a really popular guy. So that's great.
Well, if you're Peter Dinklage, then I guess I'll have to be Braun.
I guess.
The bigger, better sidekick that gets all the women, but in this case, the women would be fantasy football championships.
That's wrong across the board.
It's completely accurate, 100% accurate.
So wrong.
Fantasy pros approved.
Nope.
Yes. Okay.
All right, let's get into it.
Yeah, to reel this thing back in. We're just going to talk about general draft philosophies. We've done a pod about this. Bing. We've done, taking it back to How I Met Your Mother. Wow.
Yep, it's a fresh one.
Yeah, we did an actual podcast about this a couple weeks back. But as we get into training camp season, preseason, draft philosophies, ADPs will generally change a little bit depending on how other teams are drafting. So we'll keep a fresh perspective, and we've just done a 0 RB mock followed by a robust running back mock. And based on how both of those turned out, we can just spit hot fire as to how we feel about each one of those strategies and how we personally draft. So, Leo, I'll let you start things off.
So, yeah, we're at a very, very trendy time in fantasy football. 0 RB is just like fully taken over. You got robust RB trying to come in and do the opposite and be just as successful. I personally don't buy into either as sort of this gospel philosophy like they get treated. They get treated like, use this philosophy and you'll win, and it applies 99% of the time, and there's no reason not to do it. You hear a lot of not using 0 RB is fragile, and it's, you're just asking for trouble. And robust RB is basically just trying to counter that in any way they can. I sort of follow the more, I guess, traditional and a little less buzzwordy version of just drafting by players and not position, drafting the best player available at the best position, like talent plus situation plus scarcity, and then just kind of going off of that. And it's very player specific. It's never, I want to take, a running back in this round and a wide receiver in this round. I've never do that. I usually try to come out of the first 4 or 5 rounds with, an even amount of running backs and wide receivers, but it doesn't always go that way. If the value falls in such a way, I will go all running backs or all wide receivers. So for me, it's very player and talent specific. It's not at all a strategy, really. It's more just trying to get the best player.
Yeah, being generally flexible, like the U.S. gymnastic team. Essentially.
Yeah, sure.
When you go into a draft. I mean, I think a thing that everyone needs to be wary of is that when these articles are published, when these draft strategies are put out there, people tend to latch onto them. And the reason why they're written is because at that particular moment in time, that is where the draft value is. Now, in the past, it's always been about drafting running backs early, going heavy running back. And the 0 RB strategy has kind of piggybacked off of this recent belief that running backs, well, it's not a belief, it's a proven fact that running backs get injured at a higher clip than wide receivers. But recency bias will scare a lot of people away from drafting running backs this year in particular because of last year's running back apocalypse, essentially. So they are telling you that the value is in drafting wide receivers early, but that value is lost when everybody latches onto that draft strategy and everybody is doing it. Because then the value will shift into the other position. And I think that's what you were saying. The robust running back strategy is kind of trying to play the opposite end of the zero running back strategy. But I mean, I tend to be of the same mind. I prefer just drafting by the best player available on the board. Now, there will come a time where you do have to roster fill, but at the beginning of the draft, I mean, you take the player, not the position. And
Yeah.
you mentioned that in our last mock season pod. And that's what it comes down to for me. I mean, it's not really a flashy philosophy, and it will change depending on how the board is falling. It could end up being a zero running back draft. It could end up being a robust running back draft. It just depends on what the other players in your league are doing. And that's, I mean, again, it's kind of boring, right? That's why there aren't very many articles written like, oh, you just draft the best player. Because, I mean, who wants to write about that? And the best player is relative in the grand scheme of things, right? People will tell you that David Johnson is the best running back this year. People will tell you that Ezekiel Elliott is the best running back this year. So you really just have to do the research, kind of collect a pool of players you feel confident in, and then draft the best one by tier. By tier is how I would do it.
Yeah.
By tier. If you can break each position into tiers, where tier 1 is, you know, the elite level wide receiver, running back, tight end, etc. And then when you're looking at the draft board, it should help you evaluate the situation a little bit more. If you're sitting there saying, okay, I can draft at the end of the first tier, or I can draft at the beginning of the third tier. Now, if you're seeing a huge disparity, that's where value-based drafting does come into play, and that's where it's still effective.
Yeah, no, I'm definitely with you, especially on the tier-based idea, you know, figuring out how you tier the players, and then you want the last player in each tier, because that's where the value lies, you know, like quarterback is a great example. If you think that there's 5 quarterbacks that have top, you know, QB, overall QB1 in their range of outcomes, then you want to draft QB5. You don't want to take one because it's going to cost you more. So I'm definitely with you on that. And I think you kind of nailed the idea that you need to come up with your own subjective opinions, because the problem you see with zero RB and robust RB and any of these sort of strict strategies is they present it as, here are these projections that we made, and because they're numbers, they're objective. And because they're based off of objective numbers, this math is right, and so that's how you should do it. Except projections are just numbers people made up. They just looked at historical data and looked at a player and situation and said, I think this is how they'll do this year. Yeah. But I think that projections are just like the completely wrong way to make any sort of ranking or strategy, because you're taking something completely subjective and trying to turn it into like something objective and tangible, and that's really dangerous. You kind of you don't want to have beliefs about any players. You want to have ideas. You know, you don't want to get stuck on any one thing. You want to be very flexible, and you want to form your own subjective opinions and understand everyone's are subjective and everyone's going to have their own opinion. But you know, like you said, that's not flashy. It doesn't write well into like a step-by-step guide into, you know, here's how you win your league. So yeah, be careful. They're definitely worth reading because they do help point out some, you know, some good players to target in the mid to late rounds, and it is sort of good to know how to do those strategies in case you're in a situation that it is worth doing it, or you can identify when another team in your league is doing it and you can exploit it to your advantage. So I'm of the same mindset as you. Yeah.
Yeah, and just as a general public service announcement, a little bench dash public service announcement. A lot of these articles, you're talking about the articles that throw out a bunch of numbers to tell you why a certain draft strategy is the best. You have to make sure when you're reading them that the numbers that they are basing everything off of match your league settings, okay? Don't read an article about PPR, and oftentimes they're not explicitly stated. Like in the title of the article, it's not telling you that this is a PPR article. It might be hidden in the article, but we know typically, just as a general reader, you'll skim a lot of things. You'll highlight the important parts and you'll skim right through, kind of get an idea of what the article is trying to say. But it can be dangerous if you miss the scoring type of what the article is preaching to. If it's a PPR article telling you to avoid Adrian Peterson because he doesn't catch passes, for example. You in your league is a standard league. You don't want to hold on to that and then go into your draft and say, well, I read that article that told me not to draft Adrian Peterson, so here I am in the middle of the first, and I'm going to avoid drafting Adrian Peterson because that would be the wrong move. Because Adrian Peterson is still fantastic in standard leagues.
Yeah.
So you have to really, really be careful. You have to read between the lines and figure out, okay, can I cater this article to my league type, or should I just read it as a general philosophy for a different league type?
Yeah, it can be pretty dangerous because a lot of these articles, they'll be PPR and they won't mention it anywhere. Like a lot of these analysts they prefer PPR and they kind of exist in that echo chamber where everyone prefers PPR. So that, to them, that is the standard of, and it also helps when they are analyzing numbers because there's just more numbers to analyze when PPR is part of it because it makes players relevant that are irrelevant in standard. So that can be really dangerous. I think usually if you see a strategy and you think this doesn't make a lot of sense, it's probably because it's for a different scoring format and it just isn't overt in the way it's written. So yeah, definitely be careful of that as well.
Yeah, and you do make a good point. Sometimes it's not mentioned at all. Yeah. They just assume that based on their article history or what they generally write about, that it is a PPR league or PPR numbers that they're putting out for you. So be careful is the main point. I know we play both PPR and standard, but I mean they're drastically different when you look at how the numbers play out at the end of the year. Whereas if you look at somebody like Antonio Brown, there's like 140-point difference between where he finished in standard and where he finished in PPR. So it makes a huge difference. I mean, you were talking earlier about how the PPR kind of plays to the zero running back strategy more. It helps with the numbers, right? When they're spitting out a bunch of numbers at you, obviously in a PPR league, the wide receivers are going to have more of a value. Or in a league where you roster 3 starting wide receivers, the wide receivers are going to have more of a value because you need to fill those spots up. But if you're looking at just a standard 12-team, 2 starting running backs, 2 starting wide receivers, and a flex, you don't want to be looking at PPR projections for making your draft picks.
Yeah.
I mean, for some players, it won't really matter. I mean, it won't be that big of a deal. You're talking about the elite level talent. You still draft in both standard and PPR. But where it does make a difference is when these players have a huge advantage in PPR and you're reading an article about how you should take them in the 5th round, like Duke Johnson or something. Take Duke Johnson in the 5th. He's going to just light up the league. And then you do that in your standard draft and you're thinking, oh, shit,
Yeah, why isn't this working out?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's exactly true, yeah, and it's just something to be very careful of. You can usually those authors are pretty accessible. You can tweet at them, and more often than not, they'll respond if you're just like, hey, what scoring format was this for? If you really are enamored with an article and you want to know, you can usually just go tweet at the person and find out, which is pretty nice. Yeah, I think that's it.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean, I think we're both of the same mind in terms of how we generally draft. You just let the draft play out in front of you.
Yeah.
You don't go in with any specific draft strategy. If it turns out that that's the way the draft falls, then sure, you look at it in hindsight and say, wow, I guess I did go with 0 running back, or I went with 0 wide receiver. And then at the end of the season, if you win, then that's how you draft for the rest of your life. That's just how it works in fantasy, right?
That's how it works. Yeah, think of it as learning these strategies like you're putting a new club in your bag, like you're acquiring a new weapon, not that you're learning the be all end all of fantasy football, because the trends change, and you don't want to get swept away. You want to, even though it's more cumbersome and less fun, I guess, if you're more of like a casual player, just look at all the players, spend the time to do that, because there's no shortcut to learning this information. There's no, I do this and I follow the strategy and I draft the players and then I win, because especially even if that does somehow work out, that this draft falls perfectly, you don't win in the draft, you win in season with trades, and you can't, trades in the wire, and you can't manipulate that stuff well if you don't know who the players are. So it just behooves you to spend this time of the off season learning who the players are and making your own opinions.
Yeah. But to go back for a second, did you mean when you say put a club in the bag, are you talking about a golf club or like an actual club that you would beat somebody with physically?
Well, it just
'Cause
really
you didn't
depends.
specify. Yeah, you didn't specify. You just said it's like acquiring a new club and putting it in the
I guess the
bag.
next thing I said was weapon too, which is not
Yeah,
not the best. I
exactly.
guess I meant golf club, but we've all seen Happy Gilmore. We all know what can happen. We get it.
We do.
All right.
Yeah, I think that pretty much wraps it up. I don't have too much else to say, and we're still early. We haven't even had our first preseason game yet, which will
Mm-hmm.
be tomorrow, by the way. So there's a lot of good matchups to keep an eye on.
Yeah.
Obviously, the first week of preseason, you're not going to see very much play from the projected starters on each team, but it is interesting to watch for the like second level running back, second level wide receivers that have a chance of making the jump or possibly stealing the job. For example, Jordan Howard plays tomorrow for the Chicago Bears, and he's in one of those situations where it's already been written that he has the third down job and the short yardage situation, like the goal line work.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, who knows if that will really happen? That's just, the word coming out of camp, which you always say, just ignore it. If it's positive news, just ignore it.
Yeah, if it's positive, ignore it. If it's bad, then it's something to take note of because usually, if bad news slips past the PR machine, that means that it's probably true.
Yeah.
So bad news you can kind of pay attention to more closely, but good news just ignore. Instead, watch the games as much as you can, even though preseason is like almost unwatchable. At least like try to find highlights or something specific about the sleepers you're looking at. Try to see at least the numbers of like how many carries they got. Were they with the first team offense, second team offense? Because that stuff can be gleaned out of the games, not as much, what a beat reporter said while they were at practice over. Oh, this one player had a good run. That's it. They're the starter now. So, yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll be back with more content. We're going to try to pump out a lot of content this year for you guys. Mock drafts, just general pods where we're talking about, games. It's going to be a lot easier when the season starts, obviously, but a lot will change in the preseason. So if you're mocking now and you have this idea that, oh man, these are the values that I'm going to get, these are the players that I have to target, that's another example of you don't want to be stuck in one mindset. Yeah,
No.
okay, well, Marvin Jones is a great value now, but who knows where his ADP will be at the end of preseason. So yes, he's a fantastic value in the 7th, 8th, 9th rounds, but if word is already out that he's the number one wide receiver in Detroit. Golden Tate has been dropping the ball in camp, and that
Golden
he's been
who?
This is just
All right,
okay.
yeah, let's wrap this up.
Just cut it now.
Finish this.
Cut it on the Marvin Jones stake because he will. I mean, by the time the season starts, he'll be in the first round.
That's true.
Boom.
100%. All right.
Right here first.
Like, subscribe, comment, share. Tell everyone you've ever met about Bench Stash, or you'll regret it.
And tell everyone that you've ever met that Peter Dinklage is a part of Bench Dash.
Boom. Here he is. The Dinklage berry right here. Okay, we're gonna end this.